She was just doing her job, calm, professional, polite, like she had 100 times before. But that morning, one passenger saw her skin before he saw her service. One decision, one cruel accusation, and suddenly, she wasn't a flight attendant anymore. She was a suspect. In front of cameras, colleagues, and strangers, her dignity was dragged through the aisle, all because someone decided she didn't belong where she stood. And as security closed in, her voice trembled, not from guilt, but from disbelief. What no one on that plane knew was that her husband was watching, not from the ground, but from a few rows away. The man who spent his life fighting for justice, now watching it unravel in real time. This is the story of power, prejudice, and the price of silence. A reminder that racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles first. Before we begin, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. Because stories like this aren't just told for views. They're told so we never forget how fast humanity can vanish at 30,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed, leaving the plane wrapped in that soft, artificial calm only found miles above the clouds. A hush settled over the aisle, the kind of silence that doesn't belong on a flight. It wasn't peaceful. It was tense, heavy. Near the back, a woman stood frozen, her navy blue uniform wrinkled, her ID tag swinging slightly as her trembling hands tried to stay still. Her name was Danielle Parker, and she had worked for the airline for 7 years without a single complaint. She was known for her composure, her smile, the quiet grace that made passengers feel safe. But right now, no one was smiling back. A man, middle-aged, red-faced, with the air of someone used to being obeyed, stood in the aisle, shouting. His voice was sharp, full of that cold confidence that only comes when someone believes the world will take their side. He pointed toward her, his words blurred by rage and entitlement. To him, she wasn't an employee. She was a target. A child began to cry somewhere up front, but no one moved. No one dared to. 2 other passengers pulled out their phones, recording the scene like it was entertainment instead of humiliation. Danielle's heart pounded against her ribs. Her mind spun, trying to understand how she got here, how a misunderstanding could turn into this spectacle. All she had done was follow procedure. A simple request for the passenger to return to his seat after the seatbelt sign turned on. But to him, her instruction had been an insult, a challenge. And now she stood alone, cornered in a narrow aisle with nowhere to go. The flight attendants near the galley exchanged nervous glances, but didn't step in. Not yet. And in that brief, suffocating moment, Danielle saw something in her eyes. Not cruelty, not indifference, but fear. The same fear she felt. Fear of making it worse. Fear of being the next one singled out. Her voice cracked as she tried to remain calm. The man moved closer, invading her space. His words grew louder, uglier. Then, without warning, he grabbed her wrist. The cabin gasped. Someone shouted. In that instant, the world shrank into a blur of faces, flashing phones, and the sound of her own pulse roaring in her ears. She yanked her arm free, her uniform sleeve twisted, her breath shallow. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, but her training held her back. Flight attendants are taught to de-escalate, not to fight back, to stay calm, even when being disrespected, even when being touched. So she stood still, silent, trembling. Then came the words that changed everything. The man turned toward the cockpit and shouted for the captain, demanding the disruptive employee be removed when they landed. He called her names that made even those recording lower their phones. And when a junior flight attendant tried to step in, he sneered, saying something that made every head turn. "She doesn't belong here," he said. "I'm not taking orders from someone like her." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Thick, bitter, unmistakable. Danielle felt her chest tighten. The world slowed. And for a fleeting second, she wasn't in uniform anymore. She was just a black woman standing in a place where she suddenly wasn't welcome. The man looked satisfied, convinced his outrage would be rewarded. But somewhere in the middle rows, a man lowered his newspaper, his eyes locked on the scene, calm, calculating, but burning beneath the surface. He'd seen injustice before. He'd fought it before. He just never thought he'd have to fight it at 30,000 feet. What no one on that flight knew was that the woman standing humiliated in the aisle wasn't just another flight attendant, and the man watching in silence wasn't just another passenger. He was her husband, and he was an FBI agent. Before the chaos, before the shouting and the flashing phones, there was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a long flight. The low hum of jet engines, the shuffle of carry-on bags, the distant sound of announcements echoing through the terminal. That morning had begun like any other for Danielle Parker. She'd woken before sunrise, brewed her coffee in silence, and watched the sky shift from black to gold over the city. Her husband, Marcus, was still asleep, his badge and service weapon locked away in the drawer beside their bed. Danielle had kissed his forehead before leaving, whispering that she'd be home by midnight. Her flights were routine, Washington to Los Angeles, then back again. 12 hours, 2 crews, one world that never seemed to sleep. She loved her job, not because it was glamorous, but because it let her see humanity from above the clouds. Strangers laughing, crying, reuniting. People showing who they really were when they thought no one was watching. She had once told Marcus that flying made her believe people were mostly good, that maybe in the air everyone was equal, just passengers sharing the same fragile space between heaven and earth. He'd smiled when she said that, but he hadn't believed it. Marcus Parker had seen too much to trust in the idea of fairness. Years in the Bureau had shown him what people could do when given power, or when they thought they'd get away with using it. He admired Danielle's optimism, even envied it. She believed that kindness could change people. He believed that only accountability could. Still, he never let his fears spill into her world. He watched her walk out that morning with the same pride he always felt, that quiet awe of a man who knew his wife carried grace like armor. By the time Danielle reached the airport, the day was already in motion. The terminal was alive, businessmen rushing through gates, families arguing over snacks, flight attendants moving with mechanical precision through corridors that smelled of coffee and jet fuel. She met her crew near Gate 42, all of them smiling, half awake, joking about long shifts. There was no sign of what was coming, no omen, just the ordinary rhythm of another day in the sky. When boarding began, she stood by the entrance with her usual warmth, greeting each passenger with a nod, a welcome aboard, a small touch of professionalism that made strangers feel seen. She noticed details, as she always did, the nervous flyers clutching seat assignments, the parents juggling strollers, the first-class passengers who never made eye contact. And then there was him, the man in the tailored gray suit mid-50s, expensive watch glinting beneath the lights. His expression was that familiar blend of impatience and entitlement, the kind she'd learned to navigate carefully. He gave her a brief, dismissive glance as he stepped past, muttering something about legroom. She brushed it off. Danielle had learned not to take it personally. She'd spent years mastering the art of restraint, smiling when she wanted to frown, apologizing for things that weren't her fault, swallowing disrespect in the name of professionalism. The uniform demanded patience. The world demanded more. As the flight took off, she settled into her rhythm, checking seatbelts, pouring drinks, moving gracefully through the cabin, while turbulence rippled beneath her feet. From the outside, everything looked ordinary, but she felt it, that subtle tension that often came when she worked first class. A few glances that lingered too long, a tone of voice sharp enough to cut, the way some passengers' eyes hardened when they realized she was in charge of the cabin. It wasn't overt, not at first. Racism rarely announced itself outright. It arrived in fragments, a sigh, a complaint said too loudly, a look that said you don't belong here. Still, she smiled through it. She always did, because her mother had taught her something long ago. That dignity was not given. It was kept. The hours passed quietly. Danielle served lunch, checked on passengers, even caught herself humming softly as she moved between rows. The air outside the windows was an endless blue, the kind that made you forget the ground existed at all. It was near the final hour of the flight when everything began to change. The man in the gray suit, the same one who had brushed past her earlier, pressed the call button. She approached with her usual calm, asking if he needed anything. He said his seat wouldn't recline properly and that it was unacceptable. She apologized, offered to check the mechanism, and gently asked him to return it to the upright position since the seatbelt sign had come on. His expression tightened. That single, polite request, something she said 100 times a day, lit something in him. He looked her up and down, his jaw clenching. Then, with an edge in his voice, he told her he paid for first class and didn't take orders from her kind. Danielle froze. The words hit harder than turbulence ever could. She glanced around, half hoping someone hadn't heard. But they had. The silence said it all. Still, she stayed composed. She reminded herself of her training. Calm voice, steady tone, professional distance. She repeated the safety policy again, this time with a smile so fragile it almost cracked. He laughed, not loud but low, cruel. A laugh that said he'd won something invisible. Then he leaned back, ignoring her entirely. Danielle stepped away, her hands trembling behind her back. She didn't report it right away. She wanted to believe it was over. She wanted to believe that if she stayed calm, he would, too. But the thing about quiet humiliation is that it never stays quiet. From that moment on, he found excuses to summon her. Extra napkins, temperature too cold, too hot, a drink refilled. Each time, his tone grew sharper, his voice louder. Other passengers began to glance uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they didn't notice. And somewhere between duty and fear, Danielle felt something shifting inside her, that slow, heavy ache of realizing that no matter how hard she tried to be perfect, some people would still only see her skin. Meanwhile, 3 rows ahead, Marcus Parker sat in silence. He wasn't supposed to be there. His trip had been booked last minute, a flight home from a quiet investigation in Los Angeles. He hadn't told Danielle he'd managed to get a ticket on her return flight. He thought it would be a surprise. But as the minutes unfolded, the surprise turned into something darker. He'd been reading when he heard the tone of the man's voice, the sharpness, the entitlement, the subtle venom that Marcus had heard too many times in interrogation rooms, on body cam footage, in hate crime reports. At first, he thought maybe he was imagining it. Then he looked up and saw his wife standing there, smiling through humiliation she didn't deserve. Marcus's hands tightened around the armrests. His instinct screamed to intervene, to end it before it escalated. But he stayed still. He knew how delicate situations on planes could be. One wrong move, and things could spiral. So he watched, measured, waited. He thought it would pass, that his wife's grace would dissolve the tension, as it always did. He didn't know it was only the beginning. By the time the man grabbed her wrist, when the confrontation erupted into full view of the cabin, Marcus was already unbuckling his seatbelt. No one knew who he was. No one knew what he was capable of when someone he loved was threatened. And as the plane cruised 30,000 feet above the world, both of them were about to learn that racism doesn't need gravity to drag people down. It just needs silence. The cabin felt smaller now, the air thicker, every breath strained under invisible weight. Danielle's hand still tingled from where he grabbed her, a sting that wasn't just physical but personal, a bruise born from centuries of the same story, repeating itself in different uniforms, different tones, same cruelty. She didn't look back at him. Not yet. The rules ran through her mind like a prayer. Stay professional, de-escalate, don't react. But her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it over the engines. The man leaned back, smug and unbothered, as if nothing had happened. His drink sat untouched on the tray table, ice melting into stillness. Danielle walked quickly toward the galley at the front, each step heavy. Behind her, whispers started to ripple. A few passengers exchanged looks, the kind that said we saw that, but also we're not getting involved. Some looked down, pretending to scroll through phones, pretending the world wasn't unraveling in the next aisle. Inside the galley, Danielle tried to steady her breathing. Her reflection stared back at her from the metal cabinet door, her eyes wide, her composure fading. She pressed her palms to the cool surface and whispered to herself that she could handle it, that she had to. But somewhere deep inside, something had cracked. Marcus saw it all from his seat. The way the man smirked after she walked away. The way no one spoke up. The silence wasn't just cowardice, it was complicity. And it filled him with a cold, deliberate rage. He wasn't just a husband in that moment. He was a man who had sworn to protect people from this very kind of evil. The kind that hides behind politeness, behind privilege, behind the safety of an aisle seat. But Marcus was also trained to wait, to let the truth unfold before stepping in. He forced himself to stay seated, to study the man's behavior, to read him the way he would a suspect, the restless hands, the shifting posture, the way he looked around as if expecting approval. The man wasn't drunk. He wasn't confused. He was enjoying this. When Danielle returned, her professionalism looked intact again, but her eyes told another story. She moved down the aisle with mechanical precision, offering water, adjusting blankets, pretending everything was fine. Marcus could see the mask, that familiar one black professionals wore every day in spaces that were never built for their comfort. But the mask only held for so long. Near the final stretch of the flight, the turbulence began, small at first, then rough enough to rattle cups and unsettle passengers. Danielle moved to secure the cabin, instructing everyone to fasten seatbelts. She reached the man's row again, calm, collected, repeating the same safety request she'd made earlier. That's when it happened. The man snapped, suddenly, violently. He shoved his tray table up, spilling what remained of his drink, and hissed something sharp enough to make the woman in the next seat flinch. Then, before Danielle could step back, he grabbed her wrist again, harder this time, and pulled her slightly toward him, muttering that she was lucky to even be up here. The sound of her gasp cut through the cabin. Heads turned. Someone shouted. The seatbelt light blinked above, glowing red in the dim cabin. Marcus was already moving. In one smooth motion, he unbuckled, rose, and crossed the aisle. His steps were silent, but his presence changed everything. The kind of authority that didn't need a badge to be felt. His voice, low and steady, carried through the aisle as he told the man to remove his hand. But this wasn't a script with heroes and villains yet. The flight attendant beside Danielle looked startled. A passenger, unaware of what had really happened, muttered about keeping things calm. And in that swirl of misunderstanding, Marcus's quiet intervention became the next target. The man released Danielle only to turn his fury toward him. He looked Marcus up and down, disbelief etched across his face, as if offended that someone like him dared to interrupt. Then came the inevitable words that turned every head nearby, that pulled the tension so tight it could snap. Who do you think you are? Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. He just looked at Danielle, and that look alone told her everything. She wasn't alone anymore. She took a step back, her composure trembling at the edges, and whispered that she was fine. But Marcus knew that wasn't true. He could see the marks on her wrist, faint but real. He could see the humiliation written across her face. He had spent his life walking into rooms filled with hate, with danger, with arrogance masked as civility. But seeing it directed at the woman he loved, seeing her hold her pain in public, just to avoid becoming the angry one, that broke something inside him that training couldn't fix. A flight attendant from the back approached quickly, nervous but alert. She asked what was happening, and before Danielle could answer, the man cut in, claiming she was being aggressive, that she'd overreacted, that she touched him first. It was a lie so casual it might have worked, if Marcus hadn't been standing there. The other attendant hesitated, glancing between Danielle and the passenger, unsure what to believe. Passengers murmured. A phone camera lifted discreetly. The cabin had turned into a stage, the kind where truth and perception battled for control. Danielle's voice finally broke through, quiet but steady. She said she'd done nothing wrong. She said she was just following safety protocol. But the man wouldn't let go of the narrative. He demanded to speak to the captain, demanded that she be removed for inappropriate behavior. His words were sharp, laced with authority he didn't actually have but assumed he did. Marcus stepped forward then, not with aggression, but with certainty. His tone dropped, calm, measured, dangerous in its precision. He told the man to sit down, and something in his voice made the man freeze. Because Marcus wasn't shouting. He wasn't emotional. He was controlled, and that control carried power. The attendant, sensing a chain of command she didn't fully understand, backed away slightly. Danielle stood in silence, tears beginning to form in her eyes, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of being publicly accused or simply existing with dignity. Then came the announcement, the captain's voice cutting through the air, instructing all passengers to remain seated. The turbulence had returned, and the flight would be landing soon. But no one was calm anymore. The damage was already done. Marcus sat back down beside his wife, his jaw tight, his pulse steady only because it had to be. She tried to thank him quietly, but he shook his head. It wasn't over yet. When the wheels finally touched down, relief rippled through the cabin like an exhale. People started to gather their belongings, pretending nothing had happened, pretending they hadn't watched a woman get humiliated in real time. Then, before the seatbelt sign even went off, the man in the gray suit leaned forward and pressed his call button again. "I'll be reporting her," he said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. She laid hands on me. "I want the authorities waiting at the gate." Danielle's heart dropped. The other flight attendant looked horrified, but said nothing. And within minutes, as passengers began to disembark, the announcement came over the intercom that security would be boarding. It was happening. The nightmare that every black professional dreads, being accused of something in front of an audience, trained to believe the accuser. As officers stepped onto the plane, everything slowed. The man gestured confidently toward Danielle, spinning his story with practiced ease. The lead officer, following procedure, approached her carefully, calm but detached. Marcus rose quietly from his seat. His hand slipped into his pocket, where his identification rested, the badge that had taken him years to earn. But he didn't flash it yet. Not yet. He watched as one of the officers asked Danielle to step aside. She complied, her voice trembling as she tried to explain. The officer's face stayed neutral, but the doubt was there, that flicker of disbelief that never quite hid itself. The man smirked again, adjusting his watch, as if satisfied justice was being served. That was the moment Marcus decided silence had gone on long enough. He stood, tall and calm, and walked forward, the kind of walk that turned heads without needing words. The officers looked up, unsure who he was. The man frowned, irritation creeping back in. Marcus reached into his jacket, pulled out his credentials, and held them out, the gold badge glinting under the cabin lights. The name Special Agent Marcus D. Parker, Federal Bureau of Investigation. A pause. Then silence. Every sound in the cabin died at once. The shuffle of luggage, the murmur of voices, the false confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He simply told the officers that the woman being accused was his wife, and that he'd personally witnessed every second of the interaction. He requested they review the plane's security footage before taking any further action. The shift was instant. The officer's tone changed. The man's face drained of color. Danielle, still shaking, stared at her husband, not just with relief, but with pride. The truth had finally walked in, not as noise, not as anger, but as fact. Marcus didn't stop there. He turned to the man and said, in that same steady tone, that false reports to federal authorities carried legal consequences. The man stammered, tried to backtrack, but it was too late. The officers began escorting him off the plane for questioning. Passengers watched in stunned silence, some ashamed, some quietly relieved that justice, for once, hadn't missed its mark. As the man disappeared down the aisle, Danielle exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. She turned to Marcus, and their eyes met. Two people who'd lived through too many versions of this story, finally standing on the side of truth together. But even as the officers left, Marcus knew the battle wasn't truly over. The damage, the humiliation, couldn't be undone by a badge. And as they walked off the plane hand in hand, cameras flashing, whispers following, The world would soon learn that even at 30,000 feet, racism finds its way through the clouds. The air inside the terminal was too bright, fluorescent, cold, and sterile, a sharp contrast to the storm that had just landed inside Marcus and Danielle. They stood side by side near the arrival's gate, the luggage untouched, the hands still linked like a tether, keeping them grounded in a world that had just tried to swallow them whole. But peace never lasts long after public humiliation. The moment they stepped off the plane, the whispers followed. Passengers who'd seen it all but said nothing were now pretending to scroll through their phones, secretly recording, sending snippets to social media, whispering captions like FBI agent defends wife and racial dispute on flight. The man who'd accused Danielle, now red-faced and shaken, was being questioned near the security counter. His confidence was gone, but that didn't matter anymore. The story had already started spreading without facts, without fairness, without mercy. And within an hour, the internet had chosen its side. By the time Marcus and Danielle reached baggage claim, 2 airport police officers approached. Their expressions were polite, but Danielle could already sense it, that uneasy tone that always came before another round of questioning. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," one of them asked, clipboard in hand, "we're going to need a few minutes of your time. Standard follow-up." Marcus glanced at Danielle, his jaw tightening. "We already gave statements," he said calmly. "You can get them from the gate agents or the airline supervisor." The officer hesitated. "I understand, sir, but the passengers filed a harassment complaint. Says your wife was..." "Harassment?" Danielle's voice cracked midword. "He grabbed me. Twice. You have cameras. You have witnesses." The officer didn't meet her eyes. "Ma'am, we just have to collect both sides." Marcus stepped closer, not threateningly, but with the full gravity of someone who'd spent a career seeing justice twisted by bureaucracy. "Then collect the truth. Check the footage before you repeat a story." The officer swallowed hard and nodded, retreating to make a call. Danielle turned away, her hand trembling. The bright screens above the carousel kept flashing flight numbers, people reuniting, hugging, laughing, while she stood frozen in the middle of it all, her dignity hanging by a thread. For years, she'd worked in customer service, trained to smile through insults, to de-escalate rage, to swallow pain and call it professionalism. But this time, the wound went deeper. It wasn't just a bad passenger. It was a reminder that no matter how well she did her job, there were still people who'd see her uniform and not the woman wearing it. Marcus led her toward a quieter corner of the terminal. "Hey," he said softly, "look at me." She did. "Barely. You did nothing wrong." "Nothing," he repeated. "He wanted to humiliate you, but he failed." Danielle blinked back tears. "It doesn't matter if he failed." People believed him. For a minute, they looked at me like I was the problem. That's all it takes. One lie. He reached up, brushing her cheek gently. "Then we'll make sure the truth lasts longer than his lie." Before he could say more, his phone buzzed. It was his supervisor from D.C. A call he didn't want to take here. Not like this. But duty didn't wait for comfort. He stepped aside, answering in his calm, clipped tone. "Parker." The voice on the other end was sharp. "Marcus, I'm getting reports about an incident on Flight 1622. The airline just called headquarters. Said there's a video circulating online. You're involved." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Yes, my wife was assaulted by a passenger. I intervened." "Assaulted?" "The report says altercation. And social media." "Social media," Marcus interrupted, "isn't evidence." There was a pause. Then the voice softened. "Understood. But you know how this works. You're a federal agent, and anything with your name attached draws attention. We'll need a full written account before end of day." Marcus hung up after confirming, his expression unreadable. He turned back to Danielle. "What did they say?" she asked quietly. "That it's already online." She closed her eyes. "Of course it is." By the time they reached the parking lot, the world had already chosen its headline. Black couple causes scene on flight. FBI agent confronts passenger. The video, shaky and incomplete, had no context. Just fragments. Danielle's raised hand as she tried to pull away. Marcus standing tall, passengers gasping. No audio. No truth. Just outrage fuel. And by nightfall, the comments poured in like acid. Typical. Playing the race card again. If she didn't do anything wrong, why was security called? Danielle stopped reading after the 50th one. Marcus wanted to protect her from it, to shut it all down. But the internet wasn't a place you could silence, only survive. 2 days later, the airline released a statement, polished, vague, and hollow. We're aware of an onboard incident involving one of our crew members and a passenger. We are cooperating with authorities and reviewing video footage. No apology. No mention of her name. Just words carefully chosen to protect stock prices, not people. Danielle's union rep called that evening. They're putting you on administrative leave, she said hesitantly, until the investigation clears. Danielle sat in silence, staring at the floor. Danielle, the rep continued, it's standard procedure. It doesn't mean they think you're guilty. It's just what? Danielle interrupted, her voice trembling. It's just safer for them if I disappear while they decide if I deserve my job back. The line went quiet. Marcus, sitting beside her, clenched his fist. He wanted to fight for her, to file every report, to drag the truth into daylight. But he knew how slow justice moved, how many times he'd seen victims crushed by the weight. That night, Danielle sat alone on the porch, staring into the dark. The crickets outside hummed, indifferent to the chaos unraveling her life. Marcus joined her quietly, sitting down 2 mugs of tea. She didn't look up. Do you ever get tired of it? She asked. He frowned. Tired of what? Proving we belong. Proving we're not dangerous. Proving we deserve the benefit of the doubt. Marcus didn't answer right away. He just stared at the stars, faint, blurred by city light. Every day, he admitted, but quitting would let them win. She took a shaky breath. I don't want to be a headline, Marcus. I just wanted to do my job. He reached over, covering her hand. You did. You did it perfectly. That's what they can't stand, that you handled yourself better than any of them would have. She squeezed his hand back, tears finally falling. Then why does it feel like I lost? Marcus looked at her, his partner, his strength, and saw not defeat, but exhaustion. The kind that comes from fighting battles that never end. 3 days later, the truth began to surface. Airport footage confirmed everything. The man's aggression, the contact, the lies. The official report cleared Danielle of any wrongdoing. But the internet had already moved on. Outrage had a short attention span. No trending hashtag for cleared flight attendant. No apology posts. No restored reputation. Just silence. But not for Marcus. Because he wasn't done. He filed an official misconduct complaint against the airline, demanding accountability for the false narrative that nearly destroyed his wife's career. He released a public statement, calm, factual, firm, detailing the truth. And something unexpected happened. The story began to shift. Journalists reached out. Former flight attendants shared similar experiences. Quiet voices grew louder, saying, "We've been here too." For the first time since that flight, Danielle began to feel something she hadn't felt in weeks, power. She did an interview, not for fame, but for truth. Sitting in front of the camera, she spoke softly but with conviction. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every woman who's been told her composure matters more than her pain. The video spread fast, not sensationally, but meaningfully. Real people saw it. Real people felt it. And suddenly, the same world that had mocked her began to listen. 1 week later, Marcus and Danielle walked through that same airport again. Not as victims, not as villains, but as survivors. The terminal looked the same, but it felt different now. Danielle stopped for a moment, glancing toward the gate where it all happened. Marcus asked softly, "You okay?" She nodded. "Yeah, just remembering." He smiled faintly. "Then let's give them something else to remember." And together, they walked forward, heads high, hands clasped, not as 2 people broken by injustice, but as a couple who turned pain into proof that truth still matters. As they reached the checkpoint, a small, trembling voice called out behind them, "Mrs. Parker?" They turned. A young flight attendant, maybe 23, nervous, eyes wide, stood there clutching her badge. I wanted to say thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "for standing up. I saw what happened, and I've been scared to speak up before, but you made me want to." Danielle's eyes softened. She stepped forward and took the girl's hand. "Then promise me one thing," she said gently. "When it's your turn, don't stay quiet." The girl nodded, tears brimming. "I won't." Danielle smiled, a small, tired, victorious smile, then turned back toward the gate, ready to board her next flight. Because even after everything, she still loved the skies. The same world that had humiliated her now had to watch her rise again, stronger, braver, unbroken. And Marcus, walking beside her, whispered, "You see, the truth always takes off, even when they try to ground it." She looked at him, a soft laugh breaking through her tears. "Then let's fly." The boarding doors opened. The past stayed behind, and the world, for once, had to look up. No audio, no truth, just outrage fuel. And by nightfall, the comments poured in like acid. Typical, playing the race card again. If she didn't do anything wrong, why was security called? Danielle stopped reading after the 50th one. Marcus wanted to protect her from it, to shut it all down. But the internet wasn't a place you could silence, only survive. 2 days later, the airline released a statement, polished, vague, and hollow. "We're aware of an onboard incident involving one of our crew members and a passenger. We are cooperating with authorities and reviewing video footage." No apology, no mention of her name, just words carefully chosen to protect stock prices, not people. Danielle's union rep called that evening. "They're putting you on administrative leave," she said hesitantly, "until the investigation clears." Danielle sat in silence, staring at the floor. "Danielle," the rep continued, "it's standard procedure. It doesn't mean they think you're guilty. It's just what?" Danielle interrupted, her voice trembling. "It's just safer for them if I disappear while they decide if I deserve my job back." The line went quiet. Marcus, sitting beside her, clenched his fist. He wanted to fight for her, to file every report, to drag the truth into daylight. But he knew how slow justice moved, how many times he'd seen victims crushed by the weight. That night, Danielle sat alone on the porch, staring into the dark. The crickets outside hummed, indifferent to the chaos unraveling her life. Marcus joined her quietly, sitting down 2 mugs of tea. She didn't look up. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked. He frowned. "Tired of what?" "Proving we belong. Proving we're not dangerous. Proving we deserve the benefit of the doubt." Marcus didn't answer right away. He just stared at the stars, faint, blurred by city light. "Every day," he admitted, "but quitting would let them win." She took a shaky breath. "I don't want to be a headline, Marcus. I just wanted to do my job." He reached over, covering her hand. You did it perfectly. That's what they can't stand, that you handled yourself better than any of them would have." She squeezed his hand back, tears finally falling. "Then why does it feel like I lost?" Marcus looked at her, his partner, his strength, and saw not defeat, but exhaustion. The kind that comes from fighting battles that never end. 3 days later, the truth began to surface. Airport footage confirmed everything. The man's aggression, the contact, the lies. The official report cleared Danielle of any wrongdoing. But the internet had already moved on. Outrage had a short attention span. No trending hashtag for cleared flight attendant. No apology posts. No restored reputation. Just silence. But not for Marcus. Because he wasn't done. He filed an official misconduct complaint against the airline, demanding accountability for the false narrative that nearly destroyed his wife's career. He released a public statement, calm, factual, firm, detailing the truth. And something unexpected happened. The story began to shift. Journalists reached out. Former flight attendants shared similar experiences. Quiet voices grew louder, saying, "We've been here too." For the first time since that flight, Danielle began to feel something she hadn't felt in weeks: power. She did an interview, not for fame, but for truth. Sitting in front of the camera, she spoke softly but with conviction. "I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every woman who's been told her composure matters more than her pain." The video spread fast, not sensationally, but meaningfully. Real people saw it. Real people felt it. And suddenly, the same world that had mocked her began to listen. 1 week later, Marcus and Danielle walked through that same airport again. Not as victims, not as villains, but as survivors. The terminal looked the same, but it felt different now. Danielle stopped for a moment, glancing toward the gate where it all happened. Marcus asked softly, "You okay?" She nodded. "Yeah, just remembering." He smiled faintly. "Then let's give them something else to remember." And together, they walked forward, heads high, hands clasped, not as two people broken by injustice, but as a couple who turned pain into proof that truth still matters. But as they reached the checkpoint, a small, trembling voice called out behind them, "Mrs. Parker?" They turned. A young flight attendant, maybe 23, nervous, eyes wide, stood there clutching her badge. I wanted to say thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "for standing up. I saw what happened, and I've been scared to speak up before, but you made me want to." Danielle's eyes softened. She stepped forward and took the girl's hand. "Then promise me one thing," she said gently. "When it's your turn, don't stay quiet." The girl nodded, tears brimming. "I won't." Danielle smiled, a small, tired, victorious smile, then turned back toward the gate, ready to board her next flight. Because even after everything, she still loved the skies. The same world that had humiliated her now had to watch her rise again, stronger, braver, unbroken. And Marcus, walking beside her, whispered, "You see, the truth always takes off, even when they try to ground it." She looked at him, a soft laugh breaking through her tears. "Then let's fly." The boarding doors opened. The past stayed behind. And the world, for once, had to look up. The airline had reinstated her quietly, as corporations often do when they realize the public tide is shifting. No press release, no apology, just a cold email reading. "You have been cleared to return to active duty effective immediately." Danielle had stared at that message for an hour. Then she pressed reply and wrote only 3 words. "See you Monday." Now, as she walked toward her new gate assignment, passengers drifted by with their coffee cups and boarding passes, unaware of the storm she'd survived to stand here. The smell of jet fuel, the echo of rolling luggage, the distant sound of flight announcements, all of it felt like coming home, and yet nothing would ever feel entirely normal again. Marcus walked beside her, dressed for his own duty, but slower this morning, as if savoring her strength. He knew what this return meant. It wasn't just a job. It was reclamation. He stopped near security, taking her hands. "You don't have to do this today," he said softly. "You could take another week." She shook her head. "If I wait, I'll start to believe them, and I can't give them that." Marcus smiled faintly, proud and pained at once. "Then I'll be right here when you land." She nodded. "Always." They kissed briefly, quietly, before parting ways. 2 professionals, 2 warriors, heading back into their separate worlds. As Danielle stepped onto the plane, something inside her shifted. The hum of the cabin, the sterile scent of air filters, the crisp sound of seatbelts clicking. These were the rhythms of her life. For the first time in weeks, they comforted her. Her crew greeted her with nervous warmth. Some avoided eye contact, unsure of what to say. Others gave her subtle nods, silent acknowledgments of respect. The lead attendant, a middle-aged woman named Maria, placed a hand on Danielle's shoulder. "Good to have you back, sweetheart," she whispered. Danielle smiled. "Good to be back." As passengers boarded, Danielle felt the old rhythm returning. The smile, the calm tone, the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years making strangers feel safe 30,000 feet in the air. But beneath it all, there was a quiet defiance. Every time she straightened a headrest or helped a nervous traveler find their seat, she thought, I belong here. And I always did. Across town, Marcus was in a different kind of battle. His office phone rang nonstop. Media requests, policy inquiries, internal reviews. The Bureau's Public Affairs Department had issued a short statement defending his actions on the flight, emphasizing appropriate response to an assault incident. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with neutrality. He knew silence protected the wrong people. So he decided to speak. He didn't hold a press conference or chase headlines. He sat down at his kitchen table that evening, typed a long message, and posted it to a social account. Nothing flashy, just truth. My wife did everything right. She stayed calm, professional, kind. And still, she was treated like a threat. I've seen injustice in my line of work, but watching it hit home was different. It wasn't policy that saved her, it was proof. Proof caught on video. Proof that shouldn't have been needed. This isn't just about one flight or one man's ignorance. It's about how fast the world believes the worst about us, and how long it takes to believe the truth. The post went viral overnight, not because it was angry, but because it was honest. Thousands shared it. Airline workers, black professionals, mothers, fathers, people who'd been misjudged, misunderstood, and made to explain their existence one too many times. By morning, the story had transformed. The same media that once framed them as troublemakers now called them symbols of resilience. Danielle saw the headlines while waiting in the crew lounge. For a moment, she thought about how easily things could have gone another way, how one twist of the narrative could have ruined everything. But now she smiled, not for fame, not for vindication, but for something simpler, peace. A week later, she was scheduled on another flight, a long route to Los Angeles. Midway through boarding, a young woman approached her nervously. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you Mrs. Parker?" Danielle turned, recognizing the same uncertain tone she once carried. "Yes, that's me." The young woman hesitated, then smiled shyly. "I started flight training because of you. I saw your interview. I just wanted to say thank you." Danielle felt her throat tighten. "You don't need to thank me," she said gently. "Just promise me you'll fly with your head high, even when people try to make you feel small." The young woman nodded. "I will." As she walked away, Danielle exhaled. The moment was quiet, but it meant everything. Change didn't start with press releases. It started with courage that refused to disappear. Meanwhile, the man who'd assaulted her, the passenger who began it all, faced consequences of his own. After reviewing footage and witness testimony, the airline permanently banned him from flying their routes. He issued a brief public apology, clearly written by lawyers, but it didn't matter anymore. Danielle didn't need his remorse to heal. Forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was freedom, and she decided not to carry his hate any further. That night, as the plane soared above the clouds, Danielle stood by the galley window, staring into the endless dark sky. The cabin was silent, passengers asleep, lights dimmed, engines humming softly beneath her feet. She thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the doubt, the strength it took to rise above it. She thought about Marcus, his hand on hers, his voice steady through the chaos. For the first time, she let herself cry, not from pain but release. She whispered into the dark, "You didn't break me." Outside, lightning flickered faintly on the horizon, a reminder that even storms could be beautiful from the right perspective. When the plane landed at dawn, Danielle stood at the door to say goodbye to passengers. One by one, they smiled, thanked her, wished her a good day. Normal, ordinary, beautiful. As the last traveler stepped out, she looked down the jet bridge and saw Marcus waiting, leaning against the railing, smiling. Her heart swelled. He hadn't said he'd be here, but somehow, she knew he would be. When she reached him, he opened his arms. "Welcome home, Flight Attendant Parker." She laughed, resting her head against his chest. "Feels good to be back." He kissed her forehead. "The skies missed you." They stood there for a moment, just breathing. Two people who'd walked through fire and found each other on the other side. And as passengers hurried past, none of them realized they were walking by a story, one of pain and resilience, prejudice and truth, fear and flight. But maybe that was the point, because the best victories aren't shouted, they're lived. That night, before bed, Danielle opened her journal and wrote 3 words she hadn't dared to believe a month ago. I am free. Then she closed it, turned off the light, and slept, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as herself again. There are stories that fade the moment they end, and then there are stories like this one, stories that echo, because they remind us that silence was never safety, and that dignity, once challenged, demands an answer. Danielle's flight was just one moment in time, one confrontation among millions of quiet injustices that happen every day, unseen, unrecorded, unspoken. But what made hers different wasn't the outcome. It was the truth that refused to be buried. The camera on that passenger's phone didn't just capture an assault. It captured a reflection of the world we live in, where a black woman doing her job could still be treated like a suspect, and her word could still be questioned before it was heard. And yet, even in the middle of that humiliation, she didn't break. She held her ground with grace. She let the truth do the talking. Because sometimes survival isn't about fighting. It's about standing still while the world tries to erase you and saying, I exist. Marcus's role that day mattered too, not because he was an FBI agent, but because he was a black man who understood the danger of every misstep, every assumption, every word said too loudly. He knew that the difference between calm and catastrophe could be one wrong glance. He didn't just protect his wife. He protected a principle, that justice doesn't require permission, only courage. When Danielle walked back onto that airplane weeks later, it wasn't a victory parade. It was reclamation, a quiet declaration that she would not surrender her love for her work because of someone else's hate. Her story became a symbol for thousands of workers who'd been mistreated, misjudged, or made invisible in the name of customer service. And maybe that's what makes her story powerful. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. The truth is, racism doesn't always announce itself with slurs or violence. Sometimes it hides in tone, in assumption, in silence. It hides in the way someone looks at your uniform and decides your worth, in the way authority listens slower when the voice speaking is brown or black, in the way innocence has to be proven before compassion is offered. But here's the thing. Every story like Danielle's forces the light a little wider. Every exposure of injustice, every act of grace in the face of hate, chips away at the foundation that allows prejudice to thrive. Because it's not the camera that changes the world. It's the courage to keep the footage rolling when your heart is breaking. What Danielle and Marcus endured wasn't unique. And that's exactly why it matters. For every person who saw themselves in Danielle, tired, dismissed, trying to hold it together while the world misunderstood them, know this. Your strength is not invisible, and your worth is not negotiable. For every Marcus watching quietly from the sidelines, who steps in, who stands tall, who uses calm as a shield and love as a weapon, you are proof that protection can look like patience, and power can look like peace. And for every bystander who watched but said nothing, this story is for you too, because silence helps no one. The next time you see injustice, whether it's a word, a stare, a mistake that cuts deeper than it should speak, don't wait until someone else records it. Don't wait until the headlines arrive. Do something. Say something. Be someone who makes the world less cruel than it was 5 seconds ago. When Danielle wrote in her journal that night, I am free, she wasn't claiming freedom from the world's racism. She was claiming freedom within it. The freedom to still love what she does, to walk tall, to know that the ugliness she faced didn't define her. That's the kind of victory we rarely see on screens. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. But it's real. Because sometimes the revolution doesn't come from protests or power. It comes from one woman refusing to apologize for her existence. From one man refusing to let hate rewrite the truth. From one act of calm courage that forces the system to blink first. And maybe you're watching this right now thinking, what difference does it make? It makes every difference. Because stories like this are reminders that equality isn't a policy, it's a promise. And that promise breaks every time we look away. If Danielle had given up, her silence would have become the next person's permission. If Marcus had lost control, their story would have been twisted beyond repair. Instead, they chose restraint, truth, dignity, and the world saw it, unfiltered, undeniable, unforgettable. There's a saying, some people survive just to prove it can be done. That's what Danielle did. She survived being disrespected in her own workplace. She survived being treated like a problem when she was the one trying to help. She survived being publicly doubted, then quietly forgotten. And she still came back, uniform on, smile steady, strength unshaken, because she knew that the real fight isn't to be liked, it's to be seen. So if the story moved you, if it made you angry or sad or inspired, don't just scroll past. Remember that change doesn't come from outrage alone. It comes from awareness that sticks. It comes from people like you carrying stories like hers forward. Because every view, every share, every comment that says, "This isn't okay," adds one more crack to the wall that keeps injustice standing. Danielle's story might have taken place on a plane, but its lesson belongs on the ground, in offices, schools, neighborhoods, and homes. Wherever bias hides, courage must follow. And if you've ever been made to feel small, for your skin, your gender, your voice, hear this. You are not the problem. You are the proof that the problem exists. And the way you rise from it is what keeps hope alive. So before you go, take a breath. Think of Danielle, standing under the sterile lights of that terminal, her dignity stripped and her head still high. Think of Marcus, steady and quiet, knowing that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to kneel. And then think of yourself, what you would do if you saw that moment unfolding right in front of you. Would you look away? Or would you step forward? Because justice begins with that choice. If you believe in truth, in fairness, in stories that refuse to let injustice hide in plain sight, stay with us. Show your support not just for this story, but for every person who's ever been silenced and still found a way to stand. Like this video. Share it with someone who still believes decency matters. And subscribe, not for entertainment, but for awareness. Because every story we tell here is one more light turned on in a dark room. This is not just Danielle's story. It's ours. And until the day these stories stop repeating, we'll keep telling them, one truth at a time.